The old city museum was huge, a giant stone box full of old things. Alex liked that it was quiet. His old apartment was always noisy, and his last job felt like everyone was looking at him, judging him. Here, at night, it was just him. He was the new night guard, and he was looking for an easy, calm job. He started his first round. The museum was dark, except for the dim emergency lights and the beam from his flashlight. His footsteps echoed on the polished floors. Tap, tap, tap. He checked the heavy wooden doors, making sure they were locked tight. The air smelled old, like dust and forgotten history. He passed rows of glass cases full of broken pots and rusty tools from long ago. He walked through the Hall of Ancient Civilizations, where stone statues with blank eyes stared into the darkness. He felt small in the vast quiet. He came to a display of ancient masks. They were carved from wood with painted faces and empty eyes. Some had feathers, some had shells. They looked spooky, even in the dim light. He shone his flashlight over them, seeing every crack and faded color. He made a note in his small book, "Masks display, all clear." He turned to walk away, his mind already thinking about the next section. Then he heard it. A faint sound, like a tiny click. It was so soft he almost missed it. It sounded like something shifting, a small movement. He stopped. He listened. The museum was silent again, just the hum of the old building. He turned back to the masks. They were still, just as they had been. He stared at them for a long moment, his flashlight beam steady. Nothing. He shook his head. It was probably just the old building settling, he told himself. Old buildings make noises. He had heard that before. He took a deep breath, the air cool in his lungs. He felt a little silly for stopping. He wrote it off as his imagination playing tricks on him in the quiet, dark space. He continued his patrol, his footsteps echoing once more. But even as he walked away, a tiny part of him wondered if he had really heard something, or if the silence was just playing tricks on his mind. The masks behind him seemed to watch him go. Alex's old life felt small and cramped. His apartment was tiny, with thin walls that let in all the noise from his neighbors. Loud music, arguments, the constant rumble of the city outside. He felt like he was always in the way, always overlooked. At his old job in a big office, he was just another face in a sea of people. He wanted peace. He wanted quiet. That's why the night shift at the museum seemed perfect. Solitude. No people. Just him and the old things. He remembered the interview. The museum director, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, had seemed surprised he wanted the night shift. "It's very quiet," she had said. "Some people find it lonely." Alex had just smiled. Lonely sounded good. Quiet sounded even better. On his first day, he met Frank, the day guard. Frank was a big man with a grumpy face and a thick mustache. He smelled of old coffee. "All right, new guy," Frank had grumbled, handing him a heavy set of keys. "It's simple. Walk around, make sure doors are locked. Don't touch anything, and I mean anything. These old things are fragile, and don't fall asleep. I'll be back at 6 a.m. Frank had given him a long, hard look, then walked away without another word. Alex had watched him go, feeling a strange mix of relief and a tiny bit of fear. Alex started his patrol route. He learned the museum's layout quickly. The grand entrance hall, with its high ceilings and giant dinosaur bones. The hall of ancient civilizations, filled with dusty pots, broken statues, and the spooky masks he'd seen on his first night. The natural history wing, with its glass eyes of taxidermy animals staring out from dimly lit displays. A huge brown bear, frozen mid-roar, a stuffed owl, its head tilted. They were all so still, so quiet. He found a strange comfort in the stillness. It was the quiet he had longed for. No sirens, no loud neighbors, just the hum of the building and the distant drip of water somewhere deep inside. But as the nights passed, a new feeling started to grow. A sense of being watched, not by people, but by the silent displays themselves. Blank eyes of the statues, the glassy stares of the animals. They seemed to follow him just a little as he walked by. He knew it was silly. They were just objects. But in the deep quiet of the night, with only his own thoughts for company, the feeling grew stronger. The museum wasn't just quiet. It was a quiet that felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. It was his second night. Alex was in the Victorian-era exhibit, a room filled with old furniture, fancy dresses on mannequins, and glass cases full of delicate items. He passed a display with a collection of porcelain dolls. They had painted faces and glassy eyes, some with tiny dresses, some with little hats. He remembered seeing them on his first night. He thought one of them, a small doll with blonde curls and a blue dress, had its head facing straight forward. But tonight, as he walked past, he stopped. He looked at the doll again. Its head seemed to be tilted slightly to the left, just a little bit. He stared at it, frowning. Did he remember it wrong? Maybe it had always been like that. He shook his head. No, he was pretty sure it was straight. He leaned closer, trying to see if there was a crack, anything that would explain it. Nothing. He shrugged. His memory was probably just playing tricks on him. He made a mental note to check it again tomorrow night. Later, in the Hall of Ancient Civilizations, he was checking the glass cases. He came to one with a small ancient coin. It was dull and green with age, sitting on a velvet cushion. He remembered it being perfectly centered in the middle of the cushion. But now, it looked like it had moved a millimeter or two to the right, just barely. He squinted, leaning down. Was it his eyes? Was the glass playing tricks? He tapped the glass gently. It didn't move. He told himself it was probably vibrations from outside. Big trucks driving by, making the old building shake just a little. That could move a tiny coin. It made sense. But the incident started to add up. A tiny shift here, a slight tilt there. Nothing big, nothing that screamed danger, but enough to make him start taking mental notes. He started to pay closer attention to specific items. The doll's head, the coin, a small carved bird in a Native American display. He wanted to be sure. The quiet of the museum, which he had loved so much, now started to feel different, less comforting, more heavy. It wasn't just a peaceful quiet anymore. It felt like a watchful quiet, a quiet that was waiting for him to look away. He started to feel a tiny knot of unease in his stomach. He was alone in this vast, silent place, and the things around him seemed to be shifting. The Egyptian exhibit was always a little spooky, with its dark sarcophagi and ancient burial items. Alex was doing his usual rounds, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. He checked the display cases, making sure all the locks were secure. He came to a case that held a mummified cat. It was a small dark bundle, wrapped in old cloth, its tiny head barely visible. He remembered locking this case just an hour ago. He was sure of it. He had even given the latch an extra tug. But now, as his flashlight beam hit it, he saw it. The glass door of the display case was slightly ajar. Just a crack, maybe an inch or two open. His heart gave a little jump. He stared at it, his mind racing. How? He was the only one here. No one else had a key. He pulled out his logbook, flipping through the pages. He found his entry for the Egyptian exhibit from his last check. Mummified cat case, secure. He had written it down. He had checked it. He was sure. His hand trembled slightly as he reached out and pushed the glass door shut. It clicked into place with a soft sound that seemed too loud in the silence. He double-checked the latch, pushing it firmly, hearing the satisfying click. He tugged on the door. It was locked, secure. But it had been open. A cold prickle ran up the back of his neck. He felt like he wasn't alone. He spun around, shining his flashlight quickly into the dark corners of the room. Nothing. Just the silent sarcophagi and the still, ancient air. He felt a sudden urge to see the security cameras. He hurried to the small security room, his heart thumping against his ribs. He sat down in front of the monitors, his eyes scanning the black and white images. He rewound the footage from the Egyptian exhibit. He watched himself walk past the case, check it, and move on. Then, for the next hour, nothing. No one. No movement. The case remained locked. He watched it again. Still nothing. The camera showed the case closed the whole time, but he knew it had been open. He had seen it. He had touched it. He had locked it. A cold, heavy feeling settled in his stomach. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't the building settling. This was something else, something beyond simple mistakes. The stillness of the museum no longer felt like a quiet comfort. It felt like a waiting game. And he was the one being watched. The incidents started to happen more often. It wasn't just tiny shifts anymore. Alex was in the Roman exhibit, checking the display of ancient busts. He remembered a specific bust, a stern-faced emperor facing straight ahead. But when he came back an hour later, the bust was turned. Its stone face was now facing the wall, as if it had deliberately turned its back on the room. It was too big to have moved by itself. He stared at it, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He reached out, his hand shaking, and turned the heavy bust back to its original position. It felt cold and solid, just stone. Later, in the Hall of Knights, he found a knight's gauntlet, a metal glove, resting on the floor, not on its stand. It was a heavy piece of armor. It couldn't have just fallen. He picked it up, feeling its weight, and placed it back on its display. Then came the sounds. Faint, shuffling footsteps. He would be in the natural history wing, checking the taxidermy animals, and he would hear a soft scuffing sound from the Hall of Ancient Civilizations. He'd freeze, listening. The sound would stop. He quickly walked to the next wing, shining his flashlight into every corner. Nothing, just the silent exhibits, but the moment he turned back, the sound would start again, just a little further away, as if whatever was making it was playing a game. He started to feel a growing paranoia. He was constantly checking over his shoulder, his flashlight beam dancing across the walls. Every shadow seemed to hide something. Every creak of the old building made him jump. The museum's quiet, which he had once loved, was now filled with imagined sounds, with the echo of those shuffling footsteps that were never quite there when he looked. He started talking to himself, whispering under his breath, "It's just the wind. It's just the pipes. You're tired, Alex. You're just tired." He tried to rationalize what he was seeing, what he was hearing, but deep down he knew it wasn't rational. The museum was alive, and it was playing with him. He felt like a mouse in a giant silent maze, and something was watching him, always watching, always moving, just out of sight. The museum's quiet was now a heavy blanket pressing down on Alex. He found himself drawn to a specific exhibit in the European wing. It was called the Whispering Gallery, a collection of antique musical instruments. Old violins with broken strings, dusty pianos with missing keys, tarnished trumpets. They were beautiful, but sad, like forgotten dreams. He would stand there, his flashlight off, just listening, and he would hear them. Faint, discordant whispers, like distant broken music or voices trying to sing but failing. Sometimes it sounded like a child humming a tune that was just a little off. Sometimes it was a low, mournful sigh, like a violin playing a single, sad note. He couldn't make out any words, just the unsettling sounds. He tried to record them on his phone, holding it up, pressing the record button. He'd listen back later, his heart pounding, hoping to catch something, but the recordings were always silent. Just the hum of his phone, and then nothing. No whispers, no music. He started losing sleep. Even when he went home, his small apartment felt too loud, too bright. His dreams were filled with shifting shadows, with silent movements in the corners of his vision. He would wake up in a cold sweat, convinced he heard a faint click or a rustle or the soft shuffle of footsteps. He looked tired all the time. His friends noticed. "You okay, Alex? You look like you've seen a ghost." He would just shrug, mumbling about long shifts. He avoided telling them about the museum. Who would believe him? They'd think he was crazy. The museum was getting to him. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was a constant, watchful presence. The exhibit seemed to hum with a hidden life. He started to feel like a puppet, and something unseen was pulling the strings. The whispers from the instruments were getting louder, more insistent, even when he tried to ignore them. They weren't just sounds, they felt like thoughts, trying to push their way into his mind. He would catch himself humming the broken tunes or hearing the faint sighs even when he was far from the exhibit. The museum was not just moving its exhibits, it was moving into his head. The museum's strange games were no longer just about the exhibits, they were about him. Alex started to notice his own personal items were being moved. He'd leave his coffee mug on the security desk, filled with lukewarm coffee. He'd come back from a round, and it would be on the floor or tucked under a pile of old newspapers. He'd hang his keys on a hook by the door and later find them on a different hook or even on the floor. It was small things, but they were his things, things he touched every day. Then, one night, he found something that made his blood run cold. He was in a display of ancient maps, old, faded charts of forgotten lands. He was checking the glass, making sure it was clean. Tucked into the corner of one of the maps, barely visible, was a small, crumpled piece of paper. He pulled it out, his fingers trembling. It was a drawing. A crude sketch of a small house with a crooked chimney and a lopsided tree. He knew it instantly. It was his old house, the one he grew up in, the one he had drawn 100 times when he was a kid. He had drawn this specific picture when he was about 6, after his dad had helped him build a treehouse in the backyard. He remembered losing it, crying about it for days, and here it was, in a museum display. He knew he didn't put it there. He hadn't seen it in 20 years. How could it be here? How could anything from his childhood be here? The horror became deeply personal. This wasn't just about moving objects. This was about something that knew him, something that could reach into his past, into his memories, and pull out forgotten things. It was like the museum was saying, "I know you, Alex. I know everything about you." He felt a cold, creeping dread. Was he losing his mind, or was something specifically targeting him? The museum wasn't just playing games anymore. It was messing with his head, with his very sense of reality. The exhibits, the whispers, the moving objects, they were all part of a terrifying personal attack. He was no longer just a guard. He was a pawn in a game he didn't understand, a game played by the silent, watchful museum. The Hall of Mirrors was a strange place, even during the day. A long corridor lined with antique mirrors, some grand and gilded, some small and simple. At night, with Alex's flashlight beam bouncing off the reflective surfaces, it was a dizzying maze of his own image. He usually hurried through it, disliking the endless reflections. But tonight, as he walked, he stopped. He saw his reflection in a tall, ornate mirror. He was walking, his lamp held steady. But in the mirror, just for a split second, his reflection moved before he did. A slight tilt of the head, a flicker of a smile that wasn't his own. Then it snapped back, perfectly mirroring him. He blinked, shaking his head. It must have been a trick of the light or his tired eyes. He tried it again, deliberately tilting his head. His reflection followed perfectly. He watched it closely. Nothing. But the feeling lingered, a cold certainty that he had seen it. Then, as he continued his patrol, he started to notice something else. The exhibits seemed to be arranged to watch him. He passed a line of ancient statues in the Greek and Roman wing. He remembered them facing mostly towards the wall, their backs to the main aisle. But now they were subtly angled, not directly facing him, but just enough so their blank stone eyes seemed to follow his patrol path as he walked by. A collection of old portraits in the art gallery. The eyes in the paintings seemed to track him just a little. As he moved through the room, he realized the movements were not random. They were deliberate. They were observing him, learning his patterns. The porcelain doll, the Roman bust, the mummified cat, they weren't just moving. They were watching. They were learning. The museum wasn't just a collection of objects. It was a giant eye, and he was caught in its gaze. The whispers from the musical instruments seemed to grow louder in his mind, a low hum of observation. He felt like every step he took, every breath he made was being recorded, analyzed. The museum was a living, breathing entity, and it was studying him. He was no longer just a guard. He was an exhibit, trapped in a glass case of his own making, and the silent, unmoving objects were the ones watching him. Alex entered the main hall, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The air was thick, heavy with a silence that felt alive. He shone his flashlight around the vast space, the beam dancing across the high ceilings and the grand staircase. And then he saw it. The exhibits were arranged in a horrifying tableau, a living picture. The taxidermy animals from the natural history wing, usually frozen in static poses, were now posed in a hunting scene. A giant brown bear was mid-pounce, its claws extended, its glass eyes fixed on a terrified-looking deer, frozen in a leap. A pack of wolves were circling, their heads low, their teeth bared. It was a scene of pure, silent violence, perfectly captured. He moved his light to the ancient warrior exhibit. The knights, usually standing stiffly in their armor, were now in battle stances. Swords were raised, shields were braced. One knight, a heavy mace in his gauntleted hand, seemed to be swinging it down, frozen just before impact. The mummified cat from the Egyptian exhibit was no longer in its case. It was crouched low, as if stalking something unseen. And then the dolls. The porcelain dolls from the Victorian display. They were arranged in a tea party on a small table, their tiny cups and saucers set out. But their porcelain eyes, usually blank, were all fixed on him, on Alex, with an unsettling, unblinking stare. Their painted smiles seemed to stretch just a little in the dim light. It was a living, breathing diorama, a horrifying play acted out by inanimate objects. But the moment Alex fully entered the room, the moment his foot crossed the threshold, everything froze. The bear stopped mid-pounce. The knight's mace hung in the air. The doll's eyes remained fixed, but the subtle shift was gone. Everything was still, perfectly still. He stood there, panting, his flashlight beam shaking. He knew what he had seen. It wasn't his imagination. It was real. And then, from the distant hall of mirrors, he saw it. A flicker of movement, a quick, almost human gesture, like a hand waving or a head nodding. It was gone in an instant, but it was enough. It confirmed it. The exhibits were sentient. They were alive. And they were playing a game with him. A game he was losing. The museum was not just moving its exhibits, it was putting on a show, and he was the unwilling audience. The tableau vivant, the chilling performance by the exhibits, was the last straw. Alex felt a cold dread settle deep in his bones. He couldn't do this anymore. He couldn't spend another night in this living, breathing nightmare. He had to quit. He would call his supervisor first thing in the morning, or as soon as his shift ended, he would walk out and never look back. He forced himself to finish his rounds, his eyes darting nervously, his heart pounding with every creak and shadow. He avoided looking directly at the exhibits, trying to pretend they were just lifeless objects. He just wanted the shift to be over. He wanted to be out. Finally, the clock in the security room showed 5:05 a.m., almost time for Frank to arrive. Alex grabbed his bag, his keys, and hurried to the main entrance. The huge, ornate wooden doors were usually unlocked for the day staff, ready for the museum to open. He reached for the heavy brass handle, his hand shaking. He pushed. The doors didn't budge. He pushed harder, leaning his weight into them. Nothing. They were locked, bolted from the inside. But how? He was the only one here. He had checked them earlier, and they had been ready to unlock. He tried the latch, the heavy metal bar that slid across the inside. It was firmly in place, secured by a thick, rusty bolt that looked ancient. He hadn't seen that bolt before. He knew he hadn't. Panic flared at his chest, hot and suffocating. He tried other exits, the emergency exit in the natural history wing. He ran to it, fumbling with the push bar. It wouldn't move. It was jammed. He tried the small staff exit in the back, near the loading dock. It was blocked by a stack of old, heavy crates that hadn't been there before. He tried the phone in the security room. He picked up the receiver. No dial tone. Dead. He called his supervisor on his cell phone. No signal. Not a single bar. He was trapped. Trapped inside the museum, alone with the moving exhibits, with the silent, watchful eyes of the ancient things. He sank to the floor, his back against the cold stone wall, burying his face in his hands. The museum was silent, but it was a different kind of silence now, a triumphant silence. He could almost feel it breathing, a vast, ancient presence that had finally closed its trap. He was alone, and there was no escape. Alex tried to navigate the museum, but it was like walking through a dream. The layout seemed to change around him. Passages he remembered taking just hours ago were gone, replaced by solid walls of stone or new, unfamiliar display cases. He would turn a corner expecting to see the Hall of Ancient Civilizations, but instead he'd find himself in a room full of old farming tools, a room he didn't even remember existing. New walls appeared out of nowhere, blocking his path. He'd walk down a long corridor only to find it ended in a dead end, a blank wall where there should have been another exhibit. He tried to retrace his steps to go back the way he came, but that path would also be gone, or twisted into a different direction. He found himself walking in circles, always ending up back in the same few areas. The Hall of Mirrors, the main hall with its frozen tableau, the Egyptian exhibit. It was like the museum was a living maze, constantly shifting its walls, making sure he couldn't find his way out. The exhibits themselves were now more overtly hostile. A heavy suit of armor would suddenly shift, its metal gauntlets swinging out, forcing him to jump back. A display of ancient spears would tilt, their sharp points aimed directly at him. The taxidermy animals would seem to subtly block his path, their glassy eyes fixed on him, forcing him to walk around them to acknowledge their presence. He saw the porcelain dolls move more freely now, their heads turning slowly as he passed, their painted smiles wider, more unsettling. He tried to run, to just find any way out, but the museum seemed to stretch, to grow, to twist around him. Every time he thought he saw a way, a new wall would appear or a familiar path would vanish. The air grew heavier, thick with dust and the metallic smell. The silence was absolute, except for his own ragged breathing and the soft, almost imperceptible creak of the exhibits as they shifted. He was trapped in a nightmare, and the museum was the monster. It wasn't just moving its exhibits, it was moving the very building around him, playing a cruel game of cat and mouse. And he was the mouse, lost in a labyrinth that changed with every step. He was truly alone, and the museum was enjoying its game. Desperate and exhausted, Alex stumbled through the shifting museum. He knew he needed answers, something to explain this madness. He remembered seeing an old, dusty office tucked away behind a staff-only door near the archives. He found the door, which was now strangely unlocked, and pushed it open. The room was small and cramped, filled with old books, stacks of papers, and a thick layer of dust. It smelt musty, like forgotten secrets. He shone his flashlight around, his beam cutting through the gloom. On a cluttered desk under a pile of old ledgers, he saw it, a leather-bound journal. Its cover was worn and faded, its pages yellowed with age. He picked it up, his fingers brushing the rough leather. He opened it, his heart pounding. The handwriting was neat, but shaky, as if the person who wrote it was afraid. The first entry was dated decades ago. It belonged to a former curator of the museum. The entries detailed similar unsettling occurrences. The curator wrote about the subtle shifts, the whispers from the artifacts, and the feeling of being watched. He described his growing paranoia, his sleepless nights, his fear that he was losing his mind. The curator's belief grew stronger with each entry. "This place is alive," he had written in shaky script. It feeds on the forgotten stories, on the unseen moments within its walls." He wrote about how the museum seemed to draw life from the silence, from the lack of attention given to its ancient treasures. He believed the exhibits moved because they craved attention, they wanted to be remembered. And when they weren't, they grew angry. The journal mentioned a ritual or a way to appease the museum. It talked about acknowledging the unseen and giving voice to the forgotten. The curator had become obsessed, spending his nights trying to understand the museum's hunger. His entries became more frantic, more desperate, filled with strange symbols and rambling thoughts. Alex felt a chilling connection to the curator, a sense of understanding the man's growing madness. He wasn't alone. Someone else had seen it, someone else had known, and that knowledge, while terrifying, also brought a strange, desperate hope. Maybe, just maybe, this journal held the key to his escape. The curator's journal led Alex to a hidden passage. The curator had drawn a crude map on one of the last pages, a series of symbols and arrows pointing to a section of the museum Alex had never seen. He followed the directions, pushing aside a heavy tapestry in a forgotten corner of the ancient civilization wing. Behind it was a narrow, dark opening, barely wide enough to squeeze through. He shone his flashlight into the blackness. The air was even colder here, and the metallic smell was stronger. He squeezed through the opening, his clothes brushing against the rough stone. The passage twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the museum's hidden depths. The faint thump-thump, the museum's heartbeat seemed to grow louder here, a low, constant throb. He walked for what felt like a long time, his fear a cold knot in his stomach. Then the passage opened into a small, dusty room, and there, slumped against a cold stone wall, was a skeleton. It was dressed in an old, faded night guard uniform, the fabric brittle with age. The bones were yellowed, covered in a thin layer of dust. A rusty flashlight lay beside it. Alex gasped, stumbling back. He shone his light on the skeleton's hand. Clutched in its bony fingers was a small, leather-bound journal, identical to the curator's, but newer. He knelt down, his hands trembling, and carefully pulled it free. He opened it. The handwriting was different, less formal than the curator's, more frantic. It belonged to another night guard. The entries described the same horrors Alex was experiencing, the shifting exhibits, the phantom footsteps, the growing paranoia. The guard wrote about trying to escape, about the doors locking, about the museum changing its layout. He wrote about his growing madness, his fear that he would never get out. The last entry was short, just a few shaky words. It's found me. It wants to be seen. I can't look away. The entry ended abruptly. The ink smeared. Alex stared at the skeleton, then at the journal in his hand. He wasn't the first. This wasn't just a random haunting. The museum had done this before. It had trapped others, and it had consumed them. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was just the latest victim in a long line of night guards who had dared to notice the things that moved when they weren't looking. The museum wasn't just playing games, it was hunting, and he was next. Alex sat in the dusty, hidden room, the two journals open before him, the curator's elegant, desperate script next to the guard's frantic, terrified scrawl. He pieced together the information, a horrifying truth slowly forming in his mind. The museum was a parasitic entity. It was alive, but not in a way he understood. It didn't need food or water like a person. It fed on something else, attention and memory. The curator's journal explained it. When objects are forgotten, when their stories are untold, when people ignore the past, the museum grows stronger. It draws life from the unseen, from the neglect. The exhibits moved because they were hungry. They craved attention. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted their stories to be told. And when they weren't, when people walked past them without a second glance, when their history was forgotten, the museum grew angry. It punished those who noticed its movements, those who saw it. It trapped them inside, not to kill them quickly, but to feed on their fear, on their desperate attempts to be seen, to be remembered, to escape. The exhibits moved because they were trying to gain attention, to force people to look, to acknowledge their existence. And if you didn't, if you tried to ignore them, it would trap you and feed on your fear until you became another forgotten story, another unseen moment, another skeleton in a hidden room. The guard's journal was a chilling confirmation. He had noticed, he had seen, and the museum had trapped him, slowly driving him mad, consuming his memory and his presence until he was nothing but bones. Alex realized the museum wasn't just a building, it was a vast, ancient consciousness, a hungry beast that thrived on the forgotten and punished those who dared to remember. His own personal items being moved, the drawing of his childhood home. It was the museum trying to get his attention, to force him to acknowledge it, to make him afraid. And it had worked. He was terrified, and the museum was getting stronger. The curator's journal, and its final, rambling entries, offered a glimmer of a terrifying solution. The only way to escape, he had written, is to become truly unseen, truly forgotten. To allow the museum to consume your memory and presence in exchange for the release of another. Alex stared at the words, his mind reeling. A sacrifice, not of life, but of self. He had to become nothing, to be utterly forgotten by the museum, to let it erase him so that he could escape. Or if he chose not to, he would become the next skeleton in the hidden room, another forgotten guard. He looked at the two journals, then at the skeletal remains of the previous guard. This was the impossible choice. Either he became the next forgotten guard, slowly consumed by the museum's hunger, his memory fading until he was just another part of the forgotten past. Or he had to find a way to make the museum not want him, to make himself so uninteresting, so unnoteworthy that it would let him go. But how do you become truly unseen in a place that thrives on being seen? How do you make yourself forgotten by an entity that feeds on memory? The museum's heartbeat, the low thump-thump, seemed to pulse around him, a hungry, waiting sound. It was offering him a way out, but at a terrible price. He had to choose, fight a losing battle against a conscious entity that could twist reality, or surrender his very being to it, hoping it would be enough to break free. The dilemma was a cruel twist. He had come to the museum seeking quiet, seeking to be overlooked. Now, to escape, he had to become the ultimate overlooked. He had to disappear. But how? The choice weighed on Alex like a physical burden. Become unseen, become forgotten. But how? He tried to ignore the exhibits. He walked through the museum with his head down, his eyes fixed on the floor. He tried not to look at the statues, the dolls, the taxidermy animals. He tried not to react when he heard a faint click or a rustle. He tried to become a ghost, a shadow, just another part of the background. But the exhibits became more aggressive. They seemed to sense his attempt to ignore them. A heavy suit of armor would suddenly clatter, its metal pieces shaking loudly, forcing him to jump. A display of ancient weapons would crash to the floor, making him flinch. The porcelain dolls would appear directly in his path, their painted faces staring up at him, forcing him to step around them. He would hear whispers, louder now, calling his name, trying to break his concentration. "Alex, look at me! Look at us!" He battled his own mind. Every instinct screamed at him to look, to react, to acknowledge their presence. His heart pounded with fear. His palms were sweaty. He felt the museum trying to break him, to make him give in to its hunger for attention. It wanted his fear. It wanted his recognition. It wanted him to be terrified of its movements, to be constantly on edge, constantly looking, constantly acknowledging its power. He felt like he was losing his sanity, caught in a silent war against an invisible enemy. He was exhausted, his body aching, his mind a whirlwind of paranoia and dread. He knew he couldn't keep this up forever. The museum was slowly, surely winning. It was trying to force him to look, to see, to feed its hunger for fearful attention. As Alex battled his own mind, fighting the urge to look, to react, a sudden cold clarity washed over him. He stopped in the middle of the main hall, ignoring the faint creaks and whispers around him. He looked at the vast, silent exhibits. The museum didn't just want attention. It wanted fearful attention. It wanted the kind of attention that came from being caught off guard, from being surprised, from being terrified by what moved in the shadows. It wanted to be seen when it wasn't supposed to be seen, to create that jolt of terror, that surge of adrenaline. That was its food. That was its power. He remembered the curator's journal, the part about appeasing the museum, about acknowledging the unseen. He remembered the guard's last entry, "It wants to be seen." The exhibits were not just moving to be noticed. They were performing for him. They were trying to scare him, to make him react with fear. The way to defeat it, he realized, wasn't to be unseen. It was the opposite. It was to willingly see it, to acknowledge its presence without fear, to give it the wrong kind of attention. To give it attention, yes, but not the attention it craved. He had to give it a performance of his own. He had to look at it, not with terror, but with a strange, calm acknowledgement. He had to give it the attention of a curious observer, not a terrified victim. He had to take away its power by taking away its fear. The exhibits were not just moving. They were trying to elicit a specific response, and he would deny them that response. A strange calm settled over Alex. He took a deep breath, the metallic smell of the museum filling his lungs. He looked at a nearby display of ancient pottery. He didn't flinch. He didn't run. He just looked. And in that moment, he felt a shift, a tiny, almost imperceptible change in the air. He had found the key. Alex stopped running. He stopped flinching. He stopped trying to ignore the museum. Instead, he started to walk through it, his head held high, his flashlight beam steady. But this time, he looked at the exhibits directly. He didn't just glance, he stared. He walked up to the porcelain dolls, their painted eyes fixed on him, and he looked back calmly, without a hint of fear. He even gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Hello," he whispered to them, "I see you." He walked to the Roman bust that had turned to face the wall. He looked at its stern stone face. "You're a fine piece," he said, his voice low and steady. "A strong leader, even in stone." He walked through the Hall of Knights, past the suit of armor that had clattered. He looked at the empty helmet. "You fought bravely," he murmured. "Your story is still here." He went to the taxidermy animals in the natural history wing. He looked at the frozen bear, mid-pounce. "A magnificent creature," he said, "still powerful, even now." He talked to them, not with fear, but with a strange, calm acknowledgement. He described them, their history, their purpose. He gave them the attention they craved, but on his terms, not theirs. He wasn't afraid, he was simply observing. He was giving them the attention of a curator, not a victim. The exhibits reacted with confusion. Their movements became erratic, less purposeful. A doll's head would twitch, then freeze. A knight's gauntlet would start to lift, then drop with a soft thud. The whispers from the musical instruments became jumbled, a cacophony of disorganized sounds, then faded into silence. The museum's heartbeat, the low thump-thump, became agitated, a frantic, confused rhythm. Then it weakened, becoming faint, almost imperceptible. It was like a hungry beast being offered food it didn't like. It wanted fear, but he was giving it calm. It wanted terror, but he was giving it respect. Its power was draining away. He was giving it attention, but it was the wrong kind. And the museum, he realized, was losing its grip. As Alex continued his strange performance, walking through the museum and directly acknowledging the exhibits without fear, the museum's power visibly waned. The exhibits, which had been so aggressive, so demanding of his fear, now seemed to deflate. The porcelain dolls remained still, their painted eyes no longer holding that unsettling flicker of life. The Roman bust stayed facing forward. The knight's gauntlet remained on its stand. They became still, truly inanimate, their energy drained. The museum's heartbeat, the low thump-thump, faded completely, replaced by a deep, profound silence. Not the watchful, waiting silence from before, but a true silence. The silence of a place that had been defeated. He walked to the main entrance, his heart still pounding, but now with a different kind of beat. A beat of triumph. He reached for the heavy brass handle. He pushed. And this time the huge, ornate wooden doors swung open with a soft creak. The ancient, rusty bolt was gone. The sunlight streamed in, bright and golden, cutting through the dusty gloom of the museum. He stepped out, blinking against the sudden brightness. The air outside was fresh, clean, smelling of car exhaust and distant rain. The city sounds were loud and normal. Cars rushing by, people talking, the distant wail of a siren. He was out. He was free. He looked back at the museum, its grand stone facade now seeming dull and lifeless under the morning sun. It was just a building again, just a collection of old things. Its hunger temporarily sated, or perhaps utterly confused by his defiance. He had given it attention, but not the kind it wanted. He had looked at it, but without fear, and that, it seemed, had been enough to break its grip. He took a deep breath, the fresh air filling his lungs, and walked away, leaving the silent, defeated museum behind him. Weeks later, Alex was working a new job. It was a normal, boring job in a small office far from the museum. He tried to forget about the night shifts, about the moving exhibits, about the whispers and the terror. He tried to tell himself it was just a bad dream, a trick of his tired mind, but he couldn't. The memory of the museum still lingered, a cold shadow at the edge of his mind. He found himself constantly checking over his shoulder. Even in brightly lit rooms, he saw small, everyday objects subtly shift in his peripheral vision. A pen on his desk would seem to roll a millimeter. A book on a shelf would appear to tilt, just a fraction. He knew it wasn't real. He knew it was just his mind playing tricks, a lingering paranoia from those terrifying nights. But the feeling persisted. One afternoon, he was walking home from work. He passed a small, local history museum, a much smaller, quieter building than the one he used to guard. He usually walked by without a second glance. But today, something made him pause. He glanced at the window display. Inside, on a dusty shelf, sat a single, old porcelain doll. It had blonde curls and a blue dress, just like the one in the Victorian display. He walked past, his heart giving a small, uncomfortable thump. He felt the familiar prickle on the back of his neck, a cold sensation that made the hairs on his arms stand up. He quickly looked back. The doll was facing forward, its painted eyes staring blankly out the window. But he could swear, just for a second, its head was turned. Just a tiny tilt. Its painted eyes, he was certain, had been fixed directly on him, watching him leave. He walked faster, his pace quickening, almost a run. The memory of the museum's silent hunger, its insatiable need for attention and fear, was a cold whisper in his mind. He knew it wasn't real. He told himself it wasn't real. But the image of that doll, its head turned, its eyes watching, stayed with him. The museum was out there, and it remembered, it always remembered,